Good afternoon. My name's Owen Canfield with the opinion page of The Oklahoman, and I welcome you to today's Google Plus Hangout here on News OK regarding the 2012 election. I'm joined today by three political experts here at The Oklahoman. One is Chris Castile, who is our Washington correspondent and has been for over 20 years now. Also Megan Rowland, who covers the Senate at the State House. And finally, Mike McNutt, our chief Capitol correspondent. He generally covers the House, and both of them at the State House cover a lot of everything, but those are their main beats. Welcome to all three of you. Thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Glad to be here.
You bet.
You know, we're taping this, or we're hosting this on Wednesday, just 6 days out from the election. And I want to start, Chris, with you and talk a little bit about the federal scene. Give me your thoughts, if you would, on the presidential election 6 days out. A lot of polls show that it to be kind of a dead heat in many places. But 6 days can be an eternity in politics, as you know. So give us your take on how you think things might shake out a week from now.
Well, and as you know, Oklahoma is probably going to go for Romney. Texas probably for Romney. California for Obama. We all know the map, pretty much as it stands, and you've got about 10 swing states in there. And each of the candidates, President Obama and Governor Romney, have their own paths to getting 270 electoral votes. And, I think, most people who look at it, who've been looking at it for the last, few months and even the last few cycles, think that Governor Romney has to win Ohio. And with the president's path, obviously would be much easier with winning Ohio, but that he could still get there without winning Ohio. So it's really close. And, most of the polls in Ohio have shown Obama up by, a point or two, 3, 4, 5, just depends on the poll and what week it is. It's really tight there. If it breaks Obama's way, then he's probably going to win re-election. Back in 2004, it helped President Bush win re-election.
Right.
Not Ohio, Kerry would have won.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think a Republican has ever won the presidency without winning Ohio. Isn't that right?
That's what they say. That's correct.
Yeah.
I know there are pundits out there trying to chart a way for Romney to win it without winning Ohio, but it's extremely difficult. He'd have to win every other toss-up state: Florida, Virginia, Nevada.
It's really interesting too, because there are states with more electoral votes, of course. I think Ohio has 18.
18.
And
Florida has more.
Yeah, there's Florida. There's Texas, California. There's a bunch of states that have more, but Ohio, it seems like the past several years, election years, has become the pivotal state for each candidate.
Hey, that's correct, and it definitely was in 2004. Kerry, I think it was 120,000 votes or something in 2004. If Kerry would have won it, he would have won the presidency.
Right. You mentioned swing states. You live up in the D.C. area.
I do. I live in Virginia.
Virginia. Last time in 2008, Virginia went to Obama, went Democrat for the first time in a
64,
while. Right. What are the numbers showing you in Virginia? Does it look like Obama will hold that?
Very, within the margin of error.
Right.
All the polls, really, since the first debate. I think Obama had. I think the president had. Maybe a lead beyond the margin of error. After the Democratic convention, but after the first debate, it's been within the margin of error. Romney might be up by 1, Obama might be up by 2, depending on the poll, depending on the week. There's also a really hot U.S. Senate race there between former Governor Tim Kaine and former Senator and Governor George Allen. So we have just been inundated with that.
Hard to watch TV up there.
I know you guys haven't seen too many there, but we're ready for those ads to stop. But it's Virginia is the part of Virginia I live in, which is pretty much the D.C. suburbs, what they call Northern Virginia. It's really not that representative of the entire state. In fact, I see Romney is coming back to Virginia in the next few days, and he's going down to Virginia Beach and other areas that are a lot more conservative than the Northern Virginia. A lot of the population is in Northern Virginia, and it's probably going to go Obama. So, but that's it's called a purple state, and it's really key.
Right. Let me ask you. There's been some talk that perhaps in this year's election, someone could win the popular vote, in particular Romney, win the popular vote, but not win the Electoral College vote. That's happened 4 times in history. Most recently in
2000, right?
2000 with Bush and Gore. I guess that's certainly a possibility, isn't it?
I guess, given how close it is, I guess it is. I'm a little skeptical of that. I think if the president wins re-election, then he wins the popular vote as well. I mean, you look at some of these swing states, that have some of which have a lot of population, including Florida, Virginia, Ohio. And they're really close. So, I mean, if they remain close, I just think, and the president wins, some or all of them, and I think he wins the popular vote as well. I mean, it could happen, and I guess that talk has intensified somewhat since Sandy, just because of what's happened in New York and New Jersey, which are huge.
Right.
Democratic, they'll go the president by a large margin, but if a lot of them don't turn out, then how will that affect the popular vote? It could.
Chris, let me move on to the federal races involving Oklahoma, and that is the 1st District and the 2nd District congressional races. Right. Those are the only 2. I mean, they're all up for re-election, of course, but districts 3, 4, and 5 are I think we would agree, are safe. Would appear to be safe Republican incumbent seats. Talk a little bit about the 1st and 2nd District. I think really mostly about the 2nd District, because that's really generated a lot of interest here in Oklahoma. It's been a very hotly contested race, a lot of money spent. How do you see those shaking out? Any idea?
So the 2nd District is mostly eastern Oklahoma. It's much of eastern Oklahoma. It's really rural. Representative Dan Bourne, a Democrat who's been there since 2005, is retiring, not running for the election. So it created an open seat in a very Democratic district by registration, but a very conservative district. In fact, it obviously, since President Obama lost every county in Oklahoma, he lost those counties as well, even with ones topping 70% in Democratic registration. So what you have is Republican Mark Wayne Mullen, who owns a plumbing company in eastern Oklahoma, and his trucks are all over. It came in with a lot of name recognition. It's a very unusual situation to have somebody come in as a Republican candidate, have that kind of name recognition from his business. He runs ads for his business all the time. They're a well-known name. And on the Democratic side, you have a former state and federal prosecutor, Rob Wallace. And there was a lot of expectation, I think, at when Bourne announced that he was going to retire, that it'd be a real battleground district, that both the national parties would get involved. Democrats would want to try to hang on to that seat. Republicans would look at it as a prime pickup. But that national involvement has not happened.
That's
at least in terms of coming in and running what they call independent expenditures.
Right.
Democrats aren't buying their own TV time, nor the Republicans. The Republican House members have given Mark Wayne Mullen a lot of money.
Yeah.
Over $100,000. Rob Wallace has gotten almost no help from the National Democratic Party. You just have to think that the National Democrats looked at that and decided to put their resources. That's obviously what
clearly that's what they chose to do, and so
you got the president, at the top of the ticket,
right.
And that's not going to.
Well, that hurts candidates here in this state, no question about it. We saw that 2 years ago.
Not going to help Rob Wallace, and as I say, you've got a Republican candidate with an incredible name recognition. It's a very unique situation.
Yeah. Now, in the 1st District, we've got a Republican who ousted the incumbent, John Sullivan, in the primary, Jim Bridenstine. Is it Bridenstine or Bridenstine?
It's Bridenstine.
Yeah. And so that is likely to stay Republican, I would think, given the history of that district.
So I don't see Tulsa electing that's mostly Tulsa. And I don't see Tulsa hasn't elected a Democrat to Congress since, I believe, 1984 was the last one election there, Jim Jones.
Yeah.
And, John Olson's done very well for a Democrat in that district. You got Bridenstine's a Tea Party candidate who's term limited himself to 3 terms, and he's gotten help again from House Republicans nationally, and
really in kind of an interesting turn, and I think it says a little something about him. John Sullivan turned right around after what was a pretty nasty primary, and supported him, and which was I thought pretty honorable of him to do.
Yeah.
Hey, Chris, we had a question from Steve, a comment. His question is, what are your views on the impact of Citizens United, the Citizens United decision on the presidential election, and do you see it impacting local elections as well? Citizens United, of course, was the Supreme Court decision that allowed corporations and unions to spend large amounts of money on campaigns.
Yeah, it has just led to so much more money being spent in these races. I don't really have much insight into the races outside of Oklahoma. I can tell you that being in Virginia, being a resident of Virginia, and seeing all the ads that like Crossroads GPS, which is the Karl Rove group, has been running against Tim Kaine and for George Allen. I mean, it's just it's almost doubled probably the number of commercials we probably would have seen in that Senate race.
Yeah.
So, and I think in some of these House districts and Senate districts around the country, I look at independent expenditures on the Federal Election Commission side almost every day, checking for Oklahoma stuff, and I see these expenditures that these groups are making that were enabled by the Citizens United decision. I mean, just mammoth expenditures. These have really increased the amount of money, exponentially in the election.
Well, Mike and Megan, maybe one of you wants to take a crack at that on the state level. Do you see it? Do you see much of an impact from it, other than the fact that a lot more money is being spent?
Absolutely. Go ahead,
Megan. Go ahead, Megan. You looked at those reports. Go ahead.
Particularly in the primary, we saw an impact from Citizens United. Without Citizens United, a political action committee would be limited to give $5,000 to any individual candidate. With Citizens United, they can spend an unlimited amount on any candidate. They can't give directly to the campaign, but they can make independent expenditures. And so even in local races, House, Senate races, we saw these political action committees get involved and send ads out there. And then we saw, too, the issue of candidates getting real upset with whether some of those ads were being truthful. We had a libel suit filed in one Senate race against the candidate and the political action committee, saying that was not a true ad, and it's been interesting.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Basically, in the primary, we saw a lot of it, as Megan said, but in general, we haven't seen quite these super PAC committees get involved as we did in the primaries. And I think part of that's because we don't have a statewide race. If we'd had a statewide race this year, we'd probably see a bit more involvement of super PACs.
Before I go on with some more state stuff, I want to get back to Chris for a minute and ask you a couple of questions about the delegation, Chris. Let's just presume that the two U.S. Congress races go Republican, which I think is likely. That would give us an all-Republican delegation, all 5 members of the House, both senators, and it would give us every statewide office holder would be a Republican. This would happen first time in history. I personally find that fascinating, the change we have seen at both levels, but you're in Washington, at the federal level in our delegation, in the 20 years that you've been up there. Would you talk a little bit about that? It wasn't like this 20 years ago.
No, actually, 23 years. I came up here in 1990, and when I did, we actually had one more House member, so it was an 8-person delegation. And of the 8, 5 were Democrats. We had 4 Democratic House members, and at that time, OU President David Bourne was in the Senate, and he was a Democrat. 4 years later, we had one Democrat left, I believe, after the 1994 elections, which would have been the midterm of President Clinton's first term.
Right?
And it was just, that's when
that was the Republican takeover of the House and up there.
Exactly, Republicans took over the House. That's when you first got Tom Coburn, Steve Largent, Frank Lucas, J.C. Watts. Jim Inhofe took the Senate seat that David Boren vacated. And then 2 years later, went all Republican, when Bill Brewster, who was the Democrat that represented southeastern Oklahoma, retired, and Wes Watkins came back, switched parties, Wes Watkins, and won his old seat as a Republican.
Right. But
that lasted only 4 years, and then Brad Carson, the Democrat, came and won the seat that Coburn held when Coburn retired from his term.
I think it's just a fascinating transformation in really a short amount. 1 generation, essentially, you've seen a tremendous, 180-degree turnaround in the makeup. One other question, if I can, Chris, about the delegation. You know, we have two veteran members in the House, in Tom Cole and Frank Lucas. And then we have a first-termer or one-termer right now, James Langford here in the Oklahoma City area. And then we'll have two new ones elected in November. So that will give us three, essentially, if you will, three new members of Congress and two veterans. It may be the youngest delegation we've had in many, many years. I'm sure it is.
Yeah, I'd say going back to 1994, right, when we had
Right.
almost the entire delegation seemed to turn over that year.
How do you think that affects, you know, a small state like Oklahoma? Some of the clout we get is when we have men and women who have been a long time on, you know, in the House because it gives them committee assignments, et cetera. Do you think that, does it weaken our stance up in D.C., or will it?
I'm not sure it'll change that much, Owen, this time, because you know you will now have the Republicans are expected to hang on to that, so you'll have all
Right.
five in the majority. Sullivan, I thought never really. Sullivan didn't have a lot of clout
Right.
anyway, and Dan Bourne, of course, was a Democrat, so
Right.
he had to play zero.
Right.
And you know, was not real loyal team player as a Democrat
Right.
anyway. Langford has done amazingly well. I mean, he's become a favorite of the House Republican leadership team, and in fact, is considering a run. Is actually planning a run for a House leadership race, the Republican Policy Committee.
Right.
So and then Lucas, of course, is a chairman. Tom
Right.
Cole's on appropriations and budget, very influential.
Yeah, well represented in those for sure.
You really are, and so it's going to just be a matter of, you know, I think once the delegation is set, that they get the people on the committees that they need them on, transportation, armed services, those kinds of things, and you know, spread out the responsibilities, and I think, like I said, I don't think there's going to be much loss from the turnover this year.
Okay, I'm going to change directions a little bit and focus a little bit on what's going on in the state on Election Day. Chris, feel free to jump in if you will, if you have any questions or comments. But I'm going to direct these questions toward Mike and Megan. Let's start with Mike in the House. Mike, of course, the House is controlled, strongly controlled by the Republican Party. It ended the legislative session with 70 of the 101 seats. That number's down a little bit for various reasons. It's down at 67 now. There's 34 races on the ballot Tuesday. Do you expect that the Republicans should be able to at least hold steady at 67, or is there a chance they may lose a few, gain a few? How do you see that falling into place next week?
And most expect the House to stay pretty much at the same level, at least getting that 67. Probably more realistically getting close to that 70, which they were 2 years ago. Some optimistic Republicans think they might go to 72, 73, but that could be a stretch. A lot depends, you know, the presidential race. Turnout is going to be the key, and it's a good time probably in Oklahoma to be a Republican running for office this year.
And Megan, the same question to you. The breakdown now is 32-16 Republican, 12 races on the ballot next week. I mean, it would have to be, just an abject disaster for the Republicans not to continue to hold a strong hand out there. How do you expect it to be similar to, end up at 32-33 again, or?
The Republicans have already gained 2 seats during the primary that were held by Democrat incumbents who didn't seek re-election.
Right, that's right.
And the
so it's actually 30. What's that make it? 34 to 14. Right.
To 14. And the Democratic Party in those seats didn't even have candidates seek those incumbent seats held by Democrats. And then again, in this election, there's a number of seats without incumbents that are probably that could remain Republican, and but the Democrats are trying to pick up some seats, so we'll have to see.
I'd like to talk about a couple of the races on both sides. Megan, since you're on the camera now, I'll start with you if that's okay. A couple of interesting races. One is down in Cleveland County, Senate District 15, where Jonathan Nichols was term limited, couldn't run for election. That's been a fairly interesting race. How do you want to handicap that or tell us a little bit about it?
Well, it's been interesting. It drew 4 Republicans in the primary, Rob Standridge, a small business owner and a pharmacist, came out ahead out of a primary and a runoff election. He's been running a pretty good campaign down there, but he's being challenged by Claudia Griffith, who is a Democrat registered nurse. She's also been running a good campaign. Her husband's a city council member there in Norman.
So she's got some name recognition, you would think.
Definitely in Norman. That district also takes in part of southern Oklahoma County, like Moore.
Right.
So there'll be some new voters in that area too for them. But that should be a good race to watch.
You know, someone else who is running for re-election is Clark Jolly up in Edmond. Now, he faced a fairly significant challenge from the right back during the primary from Paul Blair, the Baptist minister, who very much I guess kind of a Tea Party, I guess you'd say a Tea Party candidate, very much to the right even of Jolly, who's a pretty conservative guy. So do you expect that now that he's gotten past that I would guess that should stay in Republican hands, barring something unforeseen? It
is. It's not been much of a campaign up there for the general election. His challenger, an incumbent, Richard Prudzinski, who...
An independent, you mean?
He's an independent,
right.
Yeah, sorry.
That's all right.
And he considers himself a libertarian, but he filed a minimal political activity form
right.
saying basically he's not going to raise funds. So that's not been much of a race up there. We'll see what happens on election day.
One other one in the Senate I wanted to touch on was Don Barrington's seat out in Lawton, two-term Republican incumbent. He faces Tony Terrell, who is a middle school teacher. Does someone like that, a challenger like that, have a crack at upsetting someone like Barrington, who's been out at the Senate for 8 years now?
We'll have to see. That's a pretty Republican
right.
district. But it is interesting that candidate Tony Terrell, education's his big issue, and it was interesting he's pledged to donate his salary that he makes as a senator, what that is over and above what he makes as a teacher to schools in his district.
Wow.
I thought that was an interesting comment down there.
We just had a comment from Brad, who wants to know, and I'll direct this to you, Megan, because it deals with the Senate. The question is, will Republicans win the old Gene Stipes seat?
Ooh, I don't know. McNutt, you want to help me out with this one?
Again, probably that Democrats should hold on to that, but it's this year's Republican base is really strong. The president remains unpopular, and I think the big question is he even will he win as many votes this year as he did 4 years ago? Right. And there are many who think that he won't. And so Democrats, that just makes it interesting. Some would consider safe Democratic seats, and we've had redistricting involved, and right. So it's hard really to look completely and say that it's the same seat. But
well, and we saw 2 years ago the drag that the president had on Democratic candidates. I mean, there were some traditionally very safe Democratic legislative seats that turned Republican. You know, J. Paul Gum and some others that you'd have thought for sure would win, and they were shown the door. So I guess right. nothing's a lock.
Right, and in a House 2 years ago in southeastern Oklahoma, in McCurtain County, they elected their first ever Republican in state history, and they since have, unfortunately that member died, and they had a special election late last year, and a Democrat won that. So at least it's still, we're seeing that a little bit in some of these districts that did elect a Republican for the first time. In southern Oklahoma, John Bennett down in southern Oklahoma, a freshman legislative Republican, is in a little trouble this year. Nobody really thought he would have trouble, but he's became a little more too much to the conservative side.
I see, yeah.
And so the Democrats got a good chance of winning that race. And meanwhile, on the eastern side, Representative John Lockhart is a Democrat, elected the first time. He was considered pretty safe, but he's in a head-to-head race, and a Republican is considered a good chance to get that seat. So it kind of swings back and forth, and a lot's going to depend on the turnout, just who goes out to vote and what they feel like when they go to the polls. Do they like a Democrat or they want to join the Republican movement that's been going on here.
Mike, I'm sorry, Megan, go ahead.
Oh, that's all right. 2 weeks ago, I was down there in the McAllister area, and that race, there were J. Paul Lane against
Larry Boggs.
Larry Boggs, and there were a lot of Larry Boggs signs out and about, and not as many for J. Paul Lane. I don't know if that's an indication of what's going to happen,
Right.
but it's like the Republican in that district's coming out strong.
Let me ask you, Mike, about one. There's a bunch of House races we could talk about, but there's one I want to talk about that's up in Tulsa, and that's the House District 71 race. That was the race where two folks ran for it last year. It was essentially a dead heat. The election results were a little in question, and the state Supreme Court eventually ruled, this thing, we can't declare a winner, and so now they're running again. Dan Arthurell, the Democrat, and Katie Henke, the Republican.
Right.
I don't recall a case like this in maybe ever. Where it went to the
this is
state
probably the
Supreme
first
Court.
time ever a legislative race. The Democrat Arthurell won the election by 3 votes. The Republican Katie Henke contested it. They had a recount. She won by a single vote. After they did the recount, they found 2 ballots in one of the machines.
Right.
And they were both for Arthurell. So if they would have counted those ballots, he would have won the recount.
Right.
Then it went to the Supreme Court, like you said, and the Supreme Court just said because of all the closeness of it and what happened with those ballots, they just said, it's up for election in November, let's let the voters decide. So as it turned out, even though in the special election in December, there were several candidates on the Republican side and 4 or 5 on the Democratic side, really didn't have that many candidates in the general election. And we come right back down to the 2 primary players earlier this year,
Right.
Arthurell and Henke. And they're going head to head, and from what I understand, it's the Democrats got a pretty good chance of winning that.
Huh.
It's pretty close in registration. It's somewhat has some more Democrats who get out the votes, pose and get out and are active voters. So Arthurell and Henke, it's pretty close, but Arthurell may be given a slight edge. Henke has gotten a little bit crosswise with some of her comments, and
Right.
some of her support from the Republican stronghold has kind of diminished in the past couple of weeks. But it'd be interesting to see what happens in that seat.
You mentioned the ballots being found at the bottom of the machine. This is the first presidential election where Oklahoma will be using its new voter machines, or new balloting machines, whatever you want to call them. And it's also the first presidential election where our voter ID law is on the books. Unlike some states, our law is fairly generous. You can show up if you have an ID, great. If you don't, you have 2 or 3 other ways that you can be allowed to vote. Do you either of you expect to see many hiccups on election night? This will be the largest turnout we've had, of course. First statewide test of the new system and the new law. Any
We hope
concern?
not. I mean, we sure hope not. I mean, we hope that everything goes smoothly. They had a pretty big hiccup in the first
Right.
primary election, and that really was a question of a problem of posting the results.
Right. The
balloting
timeliness.
and counting were all correct. It was just getting it on the website in a timely manner. They've since scrapped that software company that did that work, and the election board's doing it itself.
Right.
And we had the runoff. We didn't have any problem. So we're hoping that despite the heavier turnout, that things will go smoothly. But as far as problems with voter identification law, I don't think we'll see so far it's not been a problem in the 3 or 4 elections we've had statewide. And generally, like you say, it's pretty generous. You don't have to have a photo.
Right.
You just have to have a voter ID, usually a driver's license, and ideally your voter identification card, which voters can get in the mail, or they can go to the county election board and get it if they've lost it,
Right.
which identifies your precinct and your name, and that's all they need is some type of identification.
Right.
And if you don't, then you can still vote, and then they'll set that vote aside and that ballot aside, and then they'll check the next couple of days to see if you're a registered voter. If it is, then you'll be thrown in the final count.
I want to move on to state questions if I can while we get toward the end of our session here. There's 6 state questions on the ballot next Tuesday, and we had a comment. We had a question from Tom, who wonders why state question 766 is getting so much more publicity than the other 5 state questions. 766 deals with intangible property. I'm not going to pretend to understand all the ins and outs of it, and I don't know that we should try to make anyone else understand it, honestly, because it can be a little complicated. But I think the answer is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, I think the answer is because the chamber here in Oklahoma City is very much interested in seeing it pass, and they've spent some money on advertising to make that point. Do you think that's the answer?
That's probably it in a nutshell. They're the ones. That's probably the only state question we're seeing a lot of advertising going to. And Megan, you've written about this. Part of it, the chamber and some other groups are supporting it, and they've put a pretty good advertising campaign. And probably see quite a bit in the next couple of days.
Absolutely. I was just checking today their campaign finance reports, and it looks like the state chamber has contributed another $140,000 to the State Question 766 campaign. That's in addition to the almost $500,000 we reported that they had contributed to the, or had available to spend on that campaign.
Right.
So that's why there's a lot of businesses that are interested in this. Some of our centrally assessed companies, people are saying that it's going to be a big tax break for them. But it also, if voters say yes on this, people are saying could prevent other businesses from getting an additional tax, a new tax that didn't exist before. It's a complicated issue, but one that lots of people are interested in.
Let me touch on two others, and I'll ask you to comment on, either one of you to comment on both of these. One is 762, which would take the governor out of the parole process for nonviolent offenders. For a time, Governor Fallin was liked the idea. Right now, Oklahoma is the only state in the country that makes its governor sign off on every parole that is then recommended to her by the parole board. This would remove her from those other than the most egregious or serious crimes.
Yeah, as you say, the governor was for it before she was against it. And
right.
She basically came out against it because after her staff reviewed the proposition, and her concern was that it just took in the offender's crime that he or she was considered, current crime was considered for
right.
pardon and parole.
Right.
It didn't consider their entire criminal record.
So in other words, what you're saying is someone could go to prison for a violent crime, do his time, be paroled, reoffend for a lesser crime, and when that went before the board, he would then be considered a lesser, a non-violent, if you will, offender. And so the governor was concerned that would.
Yeah, and she said in her year and a half as governor, she's come across 450 offenders that fit that description that you just gave. So she's come out against it, and
the district attorney's council is against it.
Right.
So,
and the legislators who authored the bill are still, trying to drum up support.
Right.
But it takes a lot of wind out of their sail when a governor comes out against it.
And this is not related, but on our opinion page, we have made the point: how is it that every other state somehow manages to handle a system where the governor is not involved in every piece of it, and they somehow work things out? But the other one, 765, state question 765, would change the makeup of the DHS, would do away with the board that oversees the Department of Human Services, and replace it with some citizens advisory panels. That stems, of course, from the many large publicity stories involving DHS in the last year and a half. Does either of you have a feeling for how that may wind up? Do you think folks understand it well enough to vote it yes or no?
That's a tricky one. I think that issue is also going to be hurt by how the language on that ballot question is phrased.
Right.
Makes it sound like it's doing away with DHS as an entity.
Right.
In fact, it doesn't do that. It just does away with this 7-person commission and replaces them with several advisory boards.
Right.
I think it's going to come down to how well educated voters are on that, and also how they feel. If they feel like an advisory board is the best way to go for that agency, it's responsible for overseeing some of our most vulnerable citizens.
Yeah, the other thing too, it does moves the agency from having the commission hire or appoint the director to the governor. Now will appoint the director.
Right.
And I think it comes down, DHS has been in the news quite a bit the past couple of years. None of it good news. I mean, we've had deaths, we've had child beatings, quite a few people who have out here at the Capitol. I would say the majority of people coming here to complain about DHS issues, whether it's custody,
right.
children issues, senior citizen issues. So some people may just say they've heard enough of DHS and they feel a change is necessary.
Right.
Then I think you're going to find some people that maybe they're going to be worried about giving too much power to the governor.
Right.
Proponents say, of course, you need somebody who's elected to be accountable to the people instead of a 9-member board who's not elected or who have offices appointed by 9 years. And performance of the commission members the past year or so has improved a lot. They've seemed to be a little bit more responsive to the concerns by the media and by residents. Before that, they seemed kind of lackadaisical
Right.
and a lot of frustration. So I think it just depends who gets out to vote. I think people who are frustrated with the agency are going to say, hey, we've done this for 60, 70 years. It worked
Time
at
for a
one time,
change.
but the agency's changed. And then I think you'll see some people who may not understand it, like Megan says, or maybe wary of the governor having too much control.
Right. Well, we're going to wrap it up. Chris, Megan, and Mike, I want to thank you for taking time out of your always busy days to join us here on News OK. And I appreciate you folks watching today and invite you all to remember that next Tuesday is Election Day. It's one of our most sacred rights here in America. So please get out and vote.